All right, welcome back to the Ottawa studios of Inside My Canoe Head. I am your host, Dr. D. Today, we're going to talk about transparency in government, how it helps us all make preparedness decisions, and why I think DOGE is brilliant. So sit back, grab your argument and your favorite beverages. Let's get at her. I love that beat. That reminds me so much of the days when I used to do percussion. I mean, we were all as kids, we all had our individual, instruments that we played, and percussion was mine, much to the malign and disbelief of my mother, God bless her, that I would be there and pounding on drums. So I got those little, I forget what they were called, those little pads, drum pads that you pounded on that didn't make any noise. And that, my friends, was the recipe for success. Thanks again for joining us here at Inside My Canoe Head, the world's number 2 podcast on preparedness. We are halfway through season number 13 here at the podcast. We appreciate all of your feedback. Drop over to our website, insidemycanoehead.ca, and stay tuned. We've got some pretty fundamental, cool changes that are coming to the program, the product space, and everything we do here at Inside My Canoe Head on or about the 1st of March. So hang fire, stay tuned. Things are gonna be fun and interesting. Listen, today we want to talk about DOGE, right? Now, this is not a podcast to talk about how wonderful Elon Musk is. This is not about saying how, we need to blow things up and destroy and fire ministries and close departments. I am a Canadian. We don't have DOGE here. It is not affecting my life specifically, but I want to talk about the importance of government transparency. The reason being is it's at the very core of why we have governments and what we expect them to do. And as citizens in the preparedness space, and we think about all of the things that we want government to do for us or that they might do for us or something along that lines, there is a capacity and a capability question within government that we would love to know. Can the government really do this? Can the government be there when I need it to? Or can the government get out of my way and let me do what I want to? Those are all ideological differences in how you might frame it, but all of it based on transparency, right? So today's podcast, we're going to talk about that, the transparency in government and why I think DOGE is freaking brilliant. And I know some of you have got your fisticuffs up there and your keyboard warriors are getting after it. Just follow in. As angry as you are, listen to the podcast, listen to what I have to say, and then, as always, we love your feedback, right? We love your feedback. We want to hear everything you have to say to us. And remember, follow us over on Substack under Jeff Donaldson and as well over at the YouTube channel at Preparedness Labs. We put this all together, so whether you enjoy the audio format, the visual format, or the written format, or all three, which each has a different nuance to it, a different set of freelance details that happen, it's all there for you, free of charge, and it always will be. Listen, governments are a finicky thing. They're often maligned, never understood, and we have this weird belief that they're staffed by a host of individuals who are unproductive and inefficient. Now, whether you're a libertarian like myself or you're a socialist that believes in a really big government, we all seem to have this belief that somehow there's this substantial amount of pork barreling and waste in the government, right? We give them billions of our hard-earned dollars every year, and it seems every year they want more and more of our money, but they're delivering less and less quality services, right? And we also live in a world where we have a loss in institutional trust. And I've talked about this on a couple of podcasts before, and when we look at the surveys that have been done and levels of confidence in the politicians, confidence in our public service, and confidence in the services the public service delivers on behalf of Canadians, and you can say that for any other public service in a liberal democracy around the world, we are losing confidence in their ability to do it or that they will do it, and a general lack of trust in the system. Now, before we get into why, we kind of have to spend, I would suggest, a couple of minutes here discussing why we have government in the first place, right? If you think back in humanity, and you'll often hear me on this podcast talking about the tribal nature of humanity. the tribal nature of people and why they organize the way they do. Humans are gregarious, right? We need each other. We operate well in groups, and we don't operate well independently. It's like we're very much like a wolf pack. The pack survives, and the individual wolf is likely to die or have a very difficult time accessing the necessary resources. So we get together, and in our tribal in Dunbar's number, which is different, and Google it for a whole definition of what Dunbar's number is. When you look at different organizational levels of society, this individual theorized about the maximum size of each segment of society that would be productive and necessary. There are certain things that as a collective society we can't do for ourselves now that we've created nation states, right? There are things such as national defense, international trade, international treaties, protection of the environment, borders, a whole bunch of other things, the creation of and the management of criminal law and civil law courts, and all of the necessary tools to provide a protection of society and protect people from harm. All of those things are individual are tasks that the individual cannot do for themselves, right? And so we collectively need a government as an entity to provide us national defense. I can't do it. Now, I had a 28-year career as an Army officer. I did provide that service for Canadian, but part of a bigger institution. The institution was required. So to deliver those services, the government needs to do, because we as people can't do them for ourselves, we create institutions. Now, those institutions are created by our governance documents. And I don't want to go into a long, drawn-out historical, but I'm going to use Canada as a context. You can superimpose your governance system, but most liberal democracies follow a general principle. We, as a country, have a foundation document. For ours, it's the 1982 Constitution Act, and before that, it was the 1867 British North America Act, right? So the BNA Act was replaced by the Constitution, repatriated in 1982. And so basically that's the law of our land, and any rules that are contained within the Constitution can only be changed by a constitutional amendment. And in the Constitution, it says, so many provinces representing X percentage of the population, which is not different from the constitutional amendment process in the U.S. Constitution and other governance documents in different countries. So it's not, that different in the language around the world, right? So within that Constitution, it tasks the federal government with a certain set of things they're required to do, right? And then it also tasks the provinces with certain things they're required to be responsible for. And everything else in the middle is considered a shared responsibility, right? It's cooperative federalism, and there's other names for it, some I can't mention without pressing the explicit button. But basically it means that the Constitution, as agreed to in 1982, delineated and said, here's what the federal government must do and is responsible for. And it said, here's what the provinces and territories must do and they're responsible for. And then everything else that follows suit in the future is going to be cooperative federalism, right? So, for example, things that come along and emergency management, the subject that I'm in, the subject that I'm a professor in, was not delineated as one of the tasks within the Constitution in 1982 because it really wasn't a going concern. It was still considered civil defense, et cetera, in that area. So because of that, by default, emergency management in Canada falls under collective federalism. So you have a foundational document in every nation. It is the Constitution usually, or some other document that says this is how we've decided to organize society, right? And then we have a parliament that Constitution creates a parliament. The parliament or Congress meets, and then the Congress passes law. So basically, as you move forward from the date of your Constitution, your government, as you elect them, can create a whole bunch of new laws that create institutions that are responsible to do tasks. So basically, the tasks that governments must do are the ones that are delineated in your foundation document, as well as all of the ones that may be added in subsequent legislation, right? And, governments will change and they'll say the the dirtbags before us were horrible, and we're going to amend the legislation, etc. So the legislation itself is an ongoing thing, and challenges to the constitutionality of different laws are adjudicated by our other part of government, which is the judiciary, which is independent and above the board. And they're the final sayer as to what is constitutional and what is not. What does the founding document mean, and how do we apply it in today's society? So in general, all of that works well. The reason that's important is government is designed to do that. Now, what's happening a lot lately in liberal democracies is governments are doing a lot more. They're creating a whole bunch more systems, and they're undergoing a whole bunch of activities that they've created internal because the public service thinks it's a really good idea. They think if they did something, it would help them deliver services to Canadians better. Or we've signed some international treaties that have required the Canadian government to participate in certain committees or activities, etc. Like the Paris Accord on climate change, for example, puts a bunch of tasks and responsibilities onto the Canadian government. It's absolutely voluntary that we signed it, but by signing it, we have these responsibilities we've adhered to within international law. And while technically we can violate any treaty we want to, there are penalties in the treaty that we've agreed to being hit with those penalties if we violate them. Now, depending on the treaty, those can be serious or not. So all of that to say is there is a system that creates what the government is supposed to do, right? Now, as those requirements grow, the government needs more money. Now, how does the government get money? Well, there's only one source for funding for any government in any country, and that's the people. Now, they take it mainly from income tax, they can take it from consumption tax, they can take it from fee and services, or they could take it from corporate tax. And corporate income tax is just the same as a personal income tax because corporations need to sell stuff to people, so it's the same darn thing. In the end, there's only one human way to collect money is to take money from the people who earn it when they work. But the social contract that underlines successful government is that we understand as the people that these collective actions we need the government to do because we can't do them for ourselves, and we understand they need the resources to do it, so we fund it from our taxation, right? Now, there are three principal foundations that outline that in the government. And the number one is, first, that governments work for the people. The second one is that they work at the pleasure of the people. And the third is that the subject to the oversight of the people. And the key part of the first principle is simply put that it is the actions of the government are in the public interest. They're not for personal or professional gain, but to advance the health and well-being of society. This task is handed from the politician to the professional public service to execute. So the first principle simply says that the government is going to agree to do things that are the intent to help benefit the people and not to benefit themselves, and that the creation and existence of a professional public service is required. Because in Canada, we have 300 and soon to be 43, was 338, soon to be 343 ridings in Canada. 343 humans can't create legislation, they can't run departments, and they can't do all of this. So you need a professional public service, the experts, the people to take the interest of the government and operationalize it into actual regulatory frameworks and service delivery and projects that are actually beneficial to the Canadian population. Now, the second one is the check and balance on that action is that the governments serve at the pleasure of the people, which means we elect them and we fire them. Now, under Canadian Constitution, we're required to have an election at a minimum of every 5 years. Now, other legislation that can be brought in to have fixed election dates is fine, but nothing can violate the Constitution. We have to have an election every 5 years, which means we have an opportunity to judge whether the previous government followed the first principle, whether they judiciously managed and used our funds appropriately to develop and issue projects and systems that advance the well-being and the health of society. Basically, they did the task that we asked them to do it. They did it in the most efficient way they possibly could, and they're advancing and increasing the well-being of our society. That's exactly what we're looking for when we look at the government operations. Now, the final principle is that the government is subject to oversight of the people. This means is that for that to happen, we need to be kept aware of what they're doing, how they're expending our taxation, and what agreements they intend to arrange to support that first principle of advancing society. Now, we understand that there will always be secrets of the state that preclude public disclosure, but we try to establish systems like ombudsmans or auditor general or access to information to review the actions of the government and to report to the public. But this is an absolute requirement in the social contract, is that we hold politicians accountable and that they lead the public service as the delivery mechanism of government intent. To do so requires knowledge and disclosure of government expenditures and decisions. We need to be kept aware of what the government is doing, right? There's that old adage that you hear, trust but verify. We want to be able to trust that the government is doing all of the things in accordance with the first principle, that they're doing it in the best of interest of people, and that they're actually completing the task for which they've been assigned in the Constitution or legislation. But we don't know that unless we have access to the information. And so when they deliver these services, broadly speaking, in the Canadian context, the public service doesn't deliver many services directly to the people. They manage the projects that deliver the services. And a great example is when we open arms welcome new Canadians, new immigrants to Canada, there are a number of wonderful programs that are funded by grants through the Ministry of Immigration to local, culturally appropriate, not-for-profit organizations that deliver them. It's not a public service employee who's teaching English as a second language skills to a new immigrant. It is a not-for-profit that the government has provided funding to allow them to do it. So the position of the mandarins and the position of the public service is they're there to ensure value for money, good governance over the program, and they're to ensure that the services that we promised to provide to the immigrant community are being delivered at the quality. We have a brilliant set of evaluators and policy verification, implementation, and evaluation within the Canadian context. We're actually one of the top in the world in that sector, and that's part of the public service's responsibility, right? They have to deliver. If they can't deliver the service directly, which in a lot of times is just ineffective for them to do it because they're not the experts in it, they manage the project and make sure that it is done to the best extent possible, guarding and minimizing against risk and signing contracts appropriately. This, my friends, is how the system is designed to work, but this is not how the system is perceived to be working. We've seen markedly since the pandemic, but over time we have seen a reduction in the institutional trust that the Canadians and other liberal democracy residents have in their government's institution to be able to deliver the services for which they've designed or for new ones that they've agreed to. In any event, when we look at it, there is a reduction, significant and marked reduction, in our trust of our public servants and our ability to see it. You see it more and more in a lot of commentary is that we have inefficiencies, we have a bloated public service, there are too many of them. One of the convenient things at election time is to always call for a slash and hack of the public service. I'm not going to comment on how to do that. Michael Wernick, who is an absolute expert in this field, who is a former clerk of the Privy Council, which is Canada's most senior public servant and the deputy minister for the prime minister. He's publishing many more on that. He's written books on it. He's an expert on it. And often what people just want to hack and slash and blow things up because they're angry. They're angry that they have to pay so much money. And every time they attempt to interact with the system, it seems like it's impossible to, or every time they look, it seems like what they thought the government would be involved in or what they thought the government would be able to deliver is in fact nothing similar to what the government is actually doing. And a lot of that is a lack of information. And it's what we refer to as the ultimate lack of transparency, right? People simply don't know what the government is doing. They hear all kinds of informations when things do get out, and they get very ornery about it. Cue DOGE. Cue DOGE in the United States of America. Now, this was something that with the Republican organization very much called for and advocated for in the election and promised that they would set up the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, under Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, which I think he's been successfully pushed out. He's now off going through the primaries to become the candidate for the next Ohio governor, who he's hoping to become the governor there and make some fantastic changes in there. I personally think, to be honest, he's a future president of the United States. I think he might have won this time around, but that's my personal belief. But the point is that people have a lack of trust in the institution. We don't know what the institution's doing. And so DOGE promised to come out and just open the kimono. As an old boss of mine said, sometimes you just have to open the kimono and you have to tell everybody everything you're doing. Now, there have been ridiculous reports of what can be nowhere described but egregious expenditures of money. Okay? But we have to put that in context. A great ABC interview that was conducted with the current new Secretary of the Treasury, who's responsible for this, said there's about 1.3 billion payments that go through the U.S. Treasury every month. So yes, DOGE has found some absolutely ridiculous, abhorrent, and ideologically based expenditure of massive amounts of public funds that could have done better things. You can't argue with that. What the point is that it actually represents a pretty small fraction of the U.S. So that leads the argument in one of two directions. One, yes, there's some idiocy in here and we need to do a better job of finding it, but overall we're doing a good job. Or the other avenue of thought is, holy smokes, we just peeled back a corner of conspiracy. And if I rip this scab off, we're going to find monumental levels of pork barreling, fraud, and inconsistencies within the government. There are two schools of thought. I can't tell you what's going to happen in the future, but what DOGE has served for everybody to this point is it's delivered the transparency that we sought. We want to know what the government is doing with our money and under what contracts, quote unquote, the why, what and why, where our money is going, to whom, under what contracts, and for what purposes. We have had in most liberal democracies to use some pretty ridiculous systems like access to information. So in other words, I have a question, I have to go ask a government, find the correct ministry, phrase the question the right way, put the request in, and then they will diligently run around and try to find the information, package it up, and send it to back me. They're probably going to blow through all their timelines. None of them are held accountable. Like, public servants are not fired. Ministers are not charged with a criminal offense for failing to meet access to information timelines. So for all intents and purposes, the legislation is impotent, because unless there's some enforcement mechanism there to force the government to do it, it's a problem. But I'll tell you an inside story. My time at the Department of National Defense in the final couple of years of my military career, I was part of some of those questions, right? So I've seen access to information on the inside, and it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous because the questions that are being asked, so much information has to be dug through, and the systems for identification, storing, and controlling of information in the government is so poor that I get asked a question, yeah, okay, I see why you want that. I have no idea. I run the department, or I'm a senior manager in the department, and I have no idea how to find that information, let alone aggregate it in some type of return. So yeah, I'm going to take an enormous amount of resources, which means all the resources that I'm using internally to find the answers to an access to information request, those resources are not being used to advance the public interest and to deliver service to Canadians, right? So I find that answer and I send it off. It's a ridiculously laborious system, right? And then most of the time, half of it gets redacted for a whole bunch of poorly and vaguely defined rationale why the country can't get access to this information. And then if the sender or the person who posed the question wants to argue that it shouldn't be redacted, Now you fire up court time. And once you fire up court time, now the government has to hire a host of lawyers. And before you know it, we're expending massive amounts of public funds to try to defend our decision to black out a couple of lines on a piece of paper inquiry about the number of water fountains in the Department of National Defense buildings in Canada. Yes, I answered that question. And it took probably 1.5 years worth of human time across the entire military system to aggregate the data that this individual wanted, and it went into 2 lines of a journalism. So the point being is that the current way that Canadians can pull, and I'm using that terminology intentionally, can pull information from the government is abjectly poor, and it is not fit for purpose, right? Now, in supply chain management operations, of which I have 20 plus years of experience, everything is a push or a pull. So a pull would mean I'll hold on to stock, I'll do things I'll get ready for, but I won't do anything until somebody comes and asks me for that piece of information. I will then go off and source it to the best of my ability and provide it. A push is like a push notification on your cell phone that you will allow or don't allow when you install a new app. It would like to push you notifications about things. It would like to tell you about things. It basically asking your permission to do it, and then once you've granted permission, they will push what they think is useful and valuable to you to your cell phone. We don't have a push system. Now, in Canada, of note, we have a number of databases that can be searched by the general public or with a login ID to look at the contracts, to look at the value of the contracts, to look at the people who are winning contracts. Like, a lot of our information is generally to a certain degree with limitations available to the public, but it requires the pull, right? And now if you have a whole bunch of interest asking, it becomes very difficult to do that. What DOGE has done is taken that urn and smashed it on the ground and said, here it is. Here's absolutely everybody we're paying a payment to. And you can ask the questions. Does this cheese you off? And the one that really started the conversation with a lot of people was the fact that it was $50 or $25 million for prophylactics in Gaza, right? Under the USAID. And so this was used as an example of, does that advance the American interest? Does that help Americans? Now, the problem with a disclosure like that is it doesn't disclose the underlying documents. It doesn't disclose the rationale and where this decision was made, who made it, and why they made it. It just simply says, we paid. And releasing just payment information does raise a lot of questions, but a lot of those questions can be deferred or answered if we simply release the contracts that coincided with them. So imagine you released, and this is my recipe, and we'll get to talk to in a minute why I think it's important, is DOGE is brilliant. DOGE is the piece of transparency that we needed, that we want to trust but verify the government. And as our trust is going down, I think that's correlated to our inability to verify whether the government is doing things in my interest and whether they're judiciously using the resources I work very hard to provide the government with. And so because of that, DOGE is making people happy because it's embarrassing the heck out of the public service and the government for all of the things that they're doing. But it's not telling the full story. And again, I'm not here to decide whether the personalities in DOGE are good, whether the methodology they're using is appropriate, or whether we need something like that here in Canada. My argument is we need a push notification for all government expenditures that is readily available. Tell me what you're doing, and if I have any questions, I'll ask. What a novel and brilliant idea. Imagine if every month the government of Canada released the totality of the payments, non-individual, because payments to individuals are irrelevant, and yes, above a certain threshold, because I don't need to know that $4.13 was spent on a bottle of Windex, but that contract payments were made in accordance with the following contracts this month. Here's a link to read the full contract. Obviously, some of the contracts have to have some business information like bidding and stuff like that removed, but it's a totally visible and accessible database pushed out to Canadians every month or on a regular basis so that Canadians, journalists, and everybody else could evaluate that, right? Not to replace the Auditor General, not to replace our evaluators, not to replace the Ombudsman, but to complement it, right? And that, in my argument here today with you, is our way of increasing trust back in government. Because we loop this back to this conversation on preparedness, which this podcast is grounded in. If we don't trust the government to be able to execute their part of the bargain when it comes to what they've said they're going to be able to do in times of an emergency, then that places a larger and more difficult burden on me, because while the government says it might be able to do something, I have to be able to be prepared to do it, because I don't have the trust and confidence that when the shizzy hits the fizzy, when the time comes, that the government will actually be able to do that, and that the government will be there to deliver what they've said they will deliver. That's the question we have when we get to the position of preparedness. Now, you can translate that into every other area of activity that the government says it's involved in. They say they'll do this. They say they're able to do it, but we don't simply take them at face value. We've had far too many instances over the pandemic, during the pandemic, preceding the pandemic, and post-pandemic that have taught us that our ability to trust the government is justifiably lower. The government has demonstrated that they have a very difficult time delivering the services for which we expect. There seems to be an endless pork barreling in governments and endless handouts of money right, left, and center without any oversight, without any justification. And we see this, and it doesn't matter the political party. I traced it back for the last 9 Canadian prime ministers. In the last 9 elections, In the last 9 elections in Canada, each one of the 3 leading parties in Canada, to some degree, have offered an increased level of transparency to Canadians about what government is doing, how they're spending money, and the contracts involved. And each of the victors of those elections have gone on to do the opposite. Each one of them have reduced the amount of information available to the public. They've increased the difficulty by which the system they've designed to make it more difficult for people to access the information. They've redacted more, and each of the governments has successively created more and more centralized control in the Prime Minister's office here in Canada, or in the White House, for example, in the US, to where they control more and more of the machinations and operations of government from a very central agency. What that does is that limits the incredible professional public service we have and their ability to disclose operational details, operational payments, and many other things because of the political narrative, which means I can't simply trust that the public service is the arbiter of the truth and is the one making sure that appropriate value for money exists. I can't trust that. I need to verify it. Now, that's the point that we're at. How do we build back? And the point being is we need to increase that trust in government. And my argument is DOGE provided us that runway. Now, DOGE by default is not what I would recommend here in Canada, but the system it represents is a total release, because the reason they're using payments is payment is the final transfer of authority, right? It is, you do this and I'll pay you, and so here I'm paying you. So it's the one thing we can track that leads back to the documents, instead of trying to look for documents or trying to inquire about projects that we think or might be operating within government. If we start at the other end, if we look at every cent and large payments that were made, and then look at ones that raise concern, follow them to the documents, then we as individual Canadians and our agencies, our community groups, our political groups, our not-for-profit advocacy groups can all look at these documents and expenditures and make a subjective judgment as to whether the individual's whether this is an appropriate use of public funds, right? I'm not arguing whether it's fraud. I'm not arguing whether it's abuse. I'm saying the government of Canada, and I've been in contracting, so it's the most laborious, difficult process invented by man. But generally, pretty much every contract does follow the rules. Are there some exceptions? There always will be. But generally, they follow the contracting rules. But somebody thought this would be a really intelligent judicial use of our money. We look at it. We look at the payment. We go, You know that old saying, things that make you go, That's what we don't know. We don't have that level of transparency. And if we think there's something to hide right now, all we have to dig and try to find out where that may be through a whole bunch of access to information. If we simply just pushed all of the payment information that the government of Canada makes, again, not to individuals, to protect identities and to above a certain level, and simply opened the kimono and said to Canadians, this is what we did with your hard-earned taxpayer dollars this month, and here's the link to all of the contracts for those payments, then it is open transparency. And it almost completely, not totally, but almost completely eliminates the need for access to information because you already have it at a click, right? The documents are there, the payments are there. Ask your questions, because when I see that and I start to see judicial payments, judicial use, I start to trust, because there's an old saying, and we would call it in the Army the Globe and Mail test. If what I'm about to do, would I be proud to see my face and story on the front page of the Globe and Mail? And if the answer is to no, I probably shouldn't be doing it. But if the same thing was truth for all of the projects, all of the contracts, and all of the payments made by the public service, that they would ask themselves, is this something that's in the best interest of Canadians? And I would proudly see on the front page of the Globe and Mail, maybe that would reduce the number of kind of ridiculous things that happen in there. I believe and have absolute trust in the Canadian public service as an institution. I believe it is geared towards helping and advancing Canadians and placing Canadians and improving our well-being. The point that we have right now is the system that's in place right now, I cannot trust, nor can I verify that that is in fact true. And institutional decisions over the last decade have informed me that trusting without verifying is not something that is tenable at this point. And therefore, we need some type of transparency and subsequent accountability that does not exist in the current system, so that we can build that trust back, so that we can put the trust back in the institution of public service as it should be, and that we can go on and worry far less about that, and then leave the hacking and slashing, chainsaw and scalpel discussions about what should happen to the public service for another time. And yes, I've written some great articles over on my Substack and over at my blog on Preparedness Labs Incorporated, about that, about how we should do. Sometimes the scalpel is good and sometimes the chainsaw is good. All right, just short interruption for the show. Just want to shout out to all of our followers there across InsideMyCanoehead.ca and our parent company, Preparedness Labs Incorporated, where we offer courses on how to adopt a prepared life, how to identify your risk and the profile that you're exposed to, and how to set yourself, your family, and your profession up for success. As well, we've got a new and innovative course for solopreneurs, people that are starting their own independent side hustle journey. How do they operate within this cultural, economic, political, and natural disaster type of environment? How do you set your business up for success and insulate it against things that you don't control? All of that is over at preparednesslabs.ca. Join us over there. Follow all of our stuff. We'd love to see you. Now back to the show. So when you're thinking about performance and the government, when you're thinking about what the government does with all of that money, wouldn't you love the day where you could actually just answer that question for you? You could see where it does, where it goes. Now, for all of those of you who don't right now and complain but don't actually do anything, there are charts available online from the Ministry of Finance that show all of the payments, but they only go to a certain level of depth. My argument today is that they need to go all the way down to each individual contract and payment terms, and they need to be released on a monthly basis on a push notification. What we're trying to say is let the institution of the public service create the system by which we can trust it to do. Because right now, there is a veil of secrecy. We don't know what's going on inside the government operations. And at this point in time, in Canadian history, and I'm sure this is true in other nations, we simply can't trust that the right decisions are being made by the right people for the right reasons. Unfortunately, that time is not now, maybe in the future, but for now, we need to be able to verify that what our public service is doing is in our national interest and is in the interest of advancing the well-being, safety, and life of Canadians. Maybe we'll get back to the point where we trust by default and periodically verify. Unfortunately, we're not there right now. So thanks for joining us this week at Inside My Canoe for this conversation. Again, remember, everything that we offer here on this podcast, Substack, and over on our YouTube channel is free of charge. It is for you. It'll always be that way. It's our contribution. Drop over to our website at preparednesslabs.ca to see what we have on the paid side. We're here for you. And if we ask that you do one thing for this podcast, it's to share it with other people. Right now, we're the #1 personal preparedness podcast in Canada, and we're the #2 preparedness podcast online. We're going for #1. So be on team Inside My Canoe, because we are here for you. Take care, stay safe, and enjoy the rest of the winter.